Hi, it's Michael Blyden, and this is my second video on the same topic. So I think technically that makes it a series of at least 2 videos where I'm talking about how I have started arguing with people in the comments section of articles that appear online, articles about climate change. I have 3 things to talk about today. I did them all early this morning. There was an article on Mother Jones. The article is "The world's carbon dioxide level just hit a staggering new milestone." And that milestone is over, well, it says that it's over 400 parts per million globally. I had already thought we had hit that, but anyways, this article is new. One of the first people to comment was a guy, goes by, and he writes that CO2 levels are hardly staggering. He's saying that CO2 levels were higher than today in 85% of the past 600 million years, 6 times higher in the dinosaur period, which was hardly a burning hell. And then he says there are 3 ice ages with more CO2 than today. And then he cites a study that says that CO2 levels lagged temperature changes in the ice core records, meaning that you look at an ice core sample and what's evidenced there is that the temperature in the atmosphere changed, and then the CO2 level changed. And so I've seen this argument before, and I've never really been sure how to refute it, because they're saying that in the past, CO2 levels weren't responsible for changes in temperature in the atmosphere. Changes in temperature in the atmosphere were responsible for CO2 levels, or at least those changes followed the temperature changes. I know I've just said the same thing 3 different ways. That's actually really difficult for me to respond to, because it gets pretty seriously into atmospheric science and ice core samples. And then if you click on the links that people provide when they make this argument, they'll show you graphs with side-by-side lines, and you'll see the temperature changing, and then on this axis, time-wise, you'll see a CO2 level changing. So you think to yourself, well, where does this graph come from, and do I refute the graph? And it's a very effective argument. It kind of shut me down for a little while, until I read a post. I'm taking a class. I'm taking this University of Queensland online class on climate denial, and there's some really good information there. And I read on a forum that's part of the class, they explained something very simple that really helped me handle this argument. What climate scientists are not claiming is CO2 levels were responsible for every single change in the Earth's temperature. They're claiming that CO2 is responsible for the current change in the Earth's temperature. So that's a remarkable difference, and that's an easy way to explain this. The Earth's atmosphere is very, very complicated. One thing might change another. Levels of volcanic activity, levels of organic activity, intensity of the sun and radiation that we're getting from the sun. All these things have different effect on the temperature. CO2 isn't the only factor. And so it forces you to hew very closely to exactly what the mainstream scientific consensus is right now, which is that right now CO2 is responsible for the increase in temperature. That is the consensus among the experts. That was the nature of my response, and I tried to keep it very simple. Okay, so a few hours after I posted that response, he wrote a response to that, and he said that the mainstream scientific consensus once was that the Earth was the center of the universe. 2 examples of scientists who went against the consensus of the time, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, rejected the scientific consensus, saying ulcers were not from spicy food and stress. They received the Nobel Prize in 2005. Alfred Wegener, originator of the theory of continental drift by hypothesizing in 1912 the continents are slowly drifting around the Earth. His hypothesis was controversial and not widely accepted until the 1950s. So here's what he's doing. He's first he talks about people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and that wasn't true. So he's invoking Galileo, who was basically responsible for teaching us that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the sun was the center of the universe, that all the planets revolved around the sun, and that people disagreed with Galileo. And so I guess by proxy he's saying that he's like Galileo. I think you can understand intuitively why this is weak, but you have to pull way back to really understand why this is weak. It's confusing because he's saying something that is true. What is true is that there have been, throughout history, I'm just make sure I'm recording here, there have been, throughout history, brilliant people who went against the accepted norm, and they were right, and after like a lot of dogged determination, they were vindicated, and then everyone was like, oh, sorry, we were wrong, Galileo, you were right. And sometimes it happened after people's death, or in the case of these ulcer stress researchers or the tectonic plate guy. He may have a point with those, but what he's talking about in both of those instances is people who were experts in their field, and this was their life's work. And so I guess the question really is he an expert in the field? And is this his life's work? I'm not, and I don't think he is. And this pulls us way back to the basic issue at hand, which is that there are experts in the field, climate scientists. 97.3 of them who have published papers on the issue all agree. And so what I see him doing is that he's trying to twist around the work of the climate scientists who think that global warming is happening. He's trying to twist it to his end and claims that he is the Galileo of the age and that he is misunderstood and that he will be vindicated. And my response to him, so this is now, this goes further than I usually go, which is one extra back and forth. I said the peer review process at the time of Galileo was slightly less rigorous than it is now. That being said, there are lots of inspiring examples of experts who went against the norm and were later vindicated. If you were a climate scientist and this were your life's work, then maybe you could be that person. Are you? Or are you like me, just a concerned amateur who is genuinely afraid? So after I responded, or I guess at the same time that I responded, there were probably like 50 or 60 people that also jumped on him. He didn't really have a lot of people that agreed with him in this comment section, which I found really, really encouraging. One of his responses to some other dude, not to me, was that CO2 is a trace gas. Now, the trace gas argument, you'll see this all over the place, is a common argument, and it's a weird, like, emotional argument that doesn't have any basis in physics. He says that CO2 is a trace gas, meaning there is very little of it in the atmosphere. The increase in atmospheric CO2 in the past century is and in the past century and a half is approximately 1/10,000th of the atmosphere. So this is the trace gas argument. The trace gas argument is essentially like a very simplistic, almost like a childlike argument saying, but it's so small. How could a small thing affect a larger thing? There's no real scientific argument there. They're just saying that if current 400 parts per million right now means that CO2 is 4/10,000th of the atmosphere. And so I've seen this in a lot of quarters. People say, well, how can 4/10,000th? I mean, it's a really small amount. I mean, trace gas isn't really a technical term. It's more of like an esoteric term, which means it's a trace element. It's a small portion. So there's nothing scientifically valid about that argument. That's just your feeling that a small thing can't influence a larger thing. But let me bring up another example. Blood alcohol level, an illegal blood alcohol level is 0.08%. 0.08% means that it is 0.08 of 1%. 1% is 1/100th, 0.1 is 1/1000th, 0.01 is 1/10,000th. So 0.08 is 8/10,000ths, which is only twice the small number, but still a small number, that the 4/10,000ths that carbon dioxide makes up of our atmosphere. So if you look at it that way, you're like, 0.08, it's only 8/10,000ths, that's still illegal. That's still an illegal level of alcohol. There are a lot of other things that you can have in a much smaller amount than alcohol that will kill you, and they will still be less than 4/10,000ths of your blood. So this is how you can understand the trace gas argument, and this is how you can understand the previous argument, which said that CO2 levels trailed temperature changes. Sure, that may have happened, but that doesn't contradict what's happening now, and that actually falls outside of the claim of the mainstream scientific consensus.